Hello, Peter. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It has been an honor for us to have you here. First of all, I would like you to briefly introduce yourself and provide us with some information about your background and experience in the field of proficiency testing.
Thank you, Hamid Ezra. It's a real privilege to be able to do this and to contribute to helping build awareness of analytical quality in Iran. My first experience of proficiency testing goes back to the mid-1970s, when, as a very young graduate, I was working in a UK hospital clinical chemistry lab. Back then, Technicon's automated systems were slowly invading the laboratory, which really until the end of the 60s had been predominantly wet chemistry hand analysis. And as these automated systems came in, there was growing awareness that some form of measuring the quality of the data was needed, and comparing data from lab to lab was needed. I was doing a part-time Master of Chemical Pathology qualification at Birmingham University, and the professor, Tom Whitehead, at the Wolfson Laboratory in that university, had become the driving force behind the development of what were called external quality assurance, where all the labs in the Birmingham area received the same sample to be tested for the same analytes, and then their results would be evaluated against the known value and the mean results of all of the participants. So you could see how close to the actual data you were and how you sat in relation to all the other labs. And that's really what today we call proficiency testing. So let's move on to the early 2000s. And I joined a little American company called RT Corporation. And they had developed a proficiency testing scheme to support the US Environmental Protection Agency's analysis management of soil and water testing. This was a massive advance on what I'd got used to in Birmingham. Very computerized, online reporting, online data evaluation, but it achieved the same thing.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction. Comparing with other internal quality control tools, what would be the main advantage of participation in proficiency testing in your idea?
I think the key thing is its freedom from internal management pressures and its neutrality. Anything that is run externally is inevitably free from internal bias. And yes, you can have very robust internal quality assurance, which will support the EQA scheme. And the other big important thing is that commercial laboratories sell their data, and increasingly prospective clients want to see the historical EQA data. So the reality is that the potential client will place more weight on the EQA performance or proficiency testing performance than any internal data.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you mean that it's an independent tool in order to provide a summary of laboratory performance in different tests?
Yes, it basically says that we're part of an external quality assurance scheme, proficiency testing scheme. The organizer is independently audited because they're accredited to ISO 17043. So it is as independent and as professional as it's possible to be. And we'll come on to the sort of cheating aspect later on in this conversation, I think.
Mm-hmm. Okay, perfect. Imagine a laboratory which has purchased several suitable CRMs which covers its scope of activities, both in terms of all the matrices that they analyze and the concentration ranges. and they don't want to spend the money for participation in proficiency testing because they believe that with CRMs they can independently evaluate their performance themselves. What would be your response to such a situation?
I fully understand where they're coming from. PT is expensive, CRMs are expensive, and why do you need both? Well, in my view, the two complement each other. They are different sides of the same quality system. So if they can find a PT scheme, they should belong to it, and they should take part in it. Depends a bit on a number of factors, but at least twice a year. Their internal quality control data is probably daily or weekly. The historical internal quality assurance data shows the analytical process stability. If you plot Shewhart charts, you'll see any trends. So if the internal QA shows that the method is well controlled, you don't need more than twice a year PT. So in general, the more stable the process, the less PT is needed. CRMs are used to validate methods, to calibrate instruments. They can be used as quality control, internal quality control standards, but they're not always ideal.
Okay, you mentioned that twice a year period of frequency of participation would be sufficient if we have a good internal quality control system in place. Is it for some sensitive areas like environmental or food analysis, or in any other area you suggest frequent participation like twice a year?
I think twice a year is the absolute minimum, and many accreditation body technical auditors will only accept that under pressure. The reality is that most sensitive areas, people will participate 4 times a year, in some cases 6 times a year. The more you participate, the more certainty you have, but the more cost there is. So there's an economic balance. If it's a simple analysis and it's been done for years and is well under control, my view is that twice a year is enough. But often you can change an analytical system, a new piece of equipment, the method ceases to be quite as stable as it was, and over a period of time you may choose to do more PT until you're certain that you're back under the level of control that you previously had.
Okay, thank you very much for the explanation. Let's go to ISO 17025 class 772, in which it emphasizes on participation in proficiency testing. It says that the laboratory shall monitor its performance by comparison with results of other laboratories where available and appropriate. What is your interpretation of these two terms, available and appropriate?
This is quite a complex area. It really says what it says, but the real world doesn't make it possible for PT schemes to cover every possible matrix analyte combination. So if you're working in an environmental lab where there's a lot of samples, a lot of PT programs around the world, looking at toxic metals and organics and other pollutants in soil and water, there's not really an issue. The biggest challenge is actually the food industry. Food PT is much harder to do, to produce samples, than almost anything else, because many food materials are by definition not stable, and many countries have quarantine restrictions on the importation of food material, which makes it impossible to ship samples. Narcotic drugs are another area there where providing a PT sample is very difficult in some countries. So the narcotic control agencies in countries don't seem to want to listen to the analytical quality control people. So that's why they're not always available. Or what's available may not be appropriate. There's no point in analyzing a PT sample where the matrix doesn't match your own, or the range of analyte concentrations is vastly different from your own sample. So
okay, perfect.
In those situations, you have to do the best you can with your internal quality assurance data.
Mm-hmm. In Iran, our national accreditation system has interpreted the term availability as having a proficiency testing organizer at national level.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise, it is not mandatory for laboratories to participate in international PTs. Do you agree with such an interpretation? It limits our choices for participation, and the laboratories feel free to not to participate in PTs and not to spend in such a very useful tool for monitoring their performance.
Yeah, I agree and I don't agree. If there is a good national scheme that's accredited to 17043, fine. But in many countries, if there's no national scheme, the technical auditors, and my own personal interpretation of clause 772, means the lab should seek out an accredited PT scheme from another country. That's why there's the EPTIS PT database that's run by BAM in Germany. It's European Proficiency Testing schemes. But in some cases, if a national accreditation body takes a different view, there's not much you can do to change it, because these accreditation bodies reflect, in many cases, government policy. So it may not be good science, but it's the world.
Okay. As far as I know, some regulatory bodies have been using PTs as a tool to monitor the laboratories active in different areas, such as environmental monitoring, food and drug control system. I mean regulatory bodies besides accreditation bodies. Imagine national environmental protection agencies or others. Do you know any organization in the world, any regulatory organization in the world, who asked laboratories to participate in PTs in a specific area out of the context of ISO 17025?
There are some cases where accreditation and associated proficiency testing is mandatory. One is what's called MCERT in the UK. This is a scheme for accrediting labs doing contaminated land testing. If the lab isn't accredited to this, which goes beyond ISO 17025, the government won't accept their data. And the MCERT requirement goes beyond the basic requirements of ISO 17025 by including sample collection, storage, and transport in the scope. So there have been attempts to try and develop a PT scheme for determining that samples are not degraded during collection or storage. If you imagine collecting soil or water or sediment that contains low levels of volatile organics, and then they're stuck in the back of a car and transported for several hours or a couple of days, how can you be certain that the sample that the lab analyzes is actually representative of the sample that's been collected? So whilst PT isn't specifically put in place there by the authorities, it is required. The other problem we had, I don't know if it's still common in some countries, is that the accreditation body runs the PT program. This is completely unacceptable as far as ISO is concerned. And in Germany, they had to separate accreditation from proficiency testing in a couple of areas. So yeah, I don't think PT is ever mandatory directly, but it's mandatory as a consequence of other regulation.
Okay, thank you very much. I know that based on your experience in working with very big and international companies during your profession, you have had experience of working with some developing countries.
Mm-hmm.
Have you had any experience of PTs used in developing countries as a tool for monitoring laboratories performance?
PT tends to follow the accreditation of labs to ISO 17025. So as countries start pushing testing laboratories to become accredited to 17025, the demand for CRMs and the demands for PT follows. A good example is I was talking to some people from Indonesia about 5 or 6 years ago now, and the Indonesian government was making it mandatory for all food and water testing laboratories to be accredited to 17025. As that happened, they then started looking for PT, and I don't know if the Indonesians developed their own PT, but what has happened in the past is that as the demand for PT gets to a point where it becomes a viable business, then PT schemes will be created.
Okay, my next question is about that when a laboratory participates in a PT program, their performance is evaluated in the round that they participated. And then in the next period of 6 months, they participate again in another PT and they evaluate the performance in that round. What do you think, how they should monitor their performance in the long term after several rounds participation? How this should be monitored, and is it as important as individual round evaluation?
I think that the big issue here is trends. So if a laboratory is doing routine testing of something, they should be running within and between batch samples. So they prepare their own internal quality control material. You then plot your results daily on a Shewhart chart so you can see any drift. So if your results sit within 2 or 3 standard deviations, and there's no trend, but they stay within that range, and your PT samples reinforce that. So you're using IQA for monitoring gross failures and drift. So if a column goes down, you'll see very quickly that there's a problem. You don't really want to have a system that's out of control when you know you're going to get a PT sample. And certainly when I worked in the hospital lab, when the PT samples came in, the biochemist responsible for quality took a very special attention to the internal QA data to make sure that the sample is likely to be analyzed correctly, but anonymously. That's another interesting point. We never knew in the lab which sample was a PT sample from the external PT. It was given a fictional patient ID code and patient name. So it came in just like any other sample. I think that's probably a little extreme, but you're trying to get a measure for what you're doing.
Okay, that's interesting. My next question is that what do you think, what would be the future of PT in standards, in regulations and other legal frameworks? What do you think that will be changed and developed in the PTs, and is it going to remain the most independent evaluation and the most important tool for monitoring the quality of the laboratories in the future?
I think the relationship between ISO 17025, ISO 17043 and ISO 17034 is intentional. They're all part of a quality assurance journey. So you have a 17025 that manages the way the lab is run. 17034 manages how CRMs are made, and reference materials, and 17043, how proficiency testing programs are run. There's a philosophical issue here. In the UK and a number of other countries, PT or EQA is not a pass-fail. It's a tool to aid improvement, and the accreditation bodies work with their clients if the lab is getting failing results to try and identify why, put them in contact with people who can help them. But in some other countries, it's viewed very much as a pass-fail. And if you fail a PT test, you lose the ability to report data on that matrix analyte combination. It's a cultural thing, as I said. It's quite common in Germany, where if you fail your PT, you're out of business. That's not the point of all this. The point of this is it's a never-ending journey to quality. And it's continuous improvement. It's not an examination to get into school.
Okay, thank you very much. My last question is based on our experience in organizing PTs in the context of ISO 17043. That one of the requirements is that PT providers should prevent collusion and falsification in organizing PTs. And it's a very difficult task for us that we should cut the communication between the participants, because they call each other and they know each other and they can talk about the sample that they have received. And it's almost impossible for us to ask them not to, because it seems like a competition, and they need to have successful results. It's more important for them than to have an evaluation, an honest evaluation of their performance. What do you suggest that we can do in order to prevent such a falsification in PTs?
It's very difficult. I think the first thing is, what are the consequences of failing a PT in the market? If it cancels an accreditation for an analytical process or procedure, there's a natural tendency to fail, to cheat. On the other hand, where PT is used as part of a continuous professional development, there's actually a competitive edge. So the PT reports that come out should never identify labs. The lab knows its code number, it can see how it's performed, but it shouldn't know the identity of anybody else. The reality is, as you say, people talk and they do share codes, but my experience is it's more to take, should we say, crow about how good you are rather than anything else. There's a cultural thing here as well. If an organizer believes that a lab is cheating on a regular basis, that should be reported to the accreditation body that looks after the 17025 accreditation. That's about the only thing you can do. And ideally, the accreditation body then investigates, and if it finds any evidence of a lab or a group of labs cheating, they should all lose their accreditation.
Okay, thank you very much for explanation. My questions are finished. If there is any point that you would like to add, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. It's we live in an imperfect world, and we have to recognize that most laboratories that are accredited are commercial organizations that need to make money. And I think PT is viewed a bit like insurance. It's something you should have, but you resent spending the money. Trying to persuade customers for PT that there's more to the benefit, there's more benefit from participation than just getting an EQA result that shows their lab is performing, is the key thing. I know a number of national accreditation bodies work with PT providers to basically have collaboration days where all of the members of the PT scheme get together and talk in the presence of the PT organizer and the accreditation body. How do we make this better? How can we make it more effective? What do you want to see? What don't you want to see?
Mm-hmm.
But this has all got to be paid for. So I think you have to do the best you can with the resources available.
Yes, I do believe with you that we should be patient and see that this laboratory is getting more and more interested in participation in PTs and consider the PT, as you said, a cultural change that they see PT as a tool to monitor the performance, and they see it's worth investing in such a mechanism in order to provide them with some feedback about how good they are.
Yeah. I think that's probably one of the most powerful tools. I've yet to meet a lab manager who isn't proud of his good results.
Mm-hmm.
Or her good results.
Exactly. Okay, thank you very much for your time, Peter. It has been an honor for me to have you here, and I hope to see you again in the future. Thank you very much.
I look forward to our next meeting, Hamid Esra. It's been most enjoyable, and if, as a result of this webcast, you get questions, if you'd like to bring them together, I'm more than happy to help you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much for the time. Have a good time.
Bye now.
Bye.